thank you everybody. My name's Laura Collister. I'm the Chief Executive of Wellways, and I would like to welcome everybody here. We've got over 200 people registered to come to this event in person, which is terrific, and we've actually got about 450 people online for this event as well, and everybody is welcome. We've been thrilled with the level of interest in this event, and that perhaps demonstrates what an important topic we're going to be talking about tonight. I would like to acknowledge and especially welcome Wellways board members and members of our Lived and Living Experience Authority. Other notable guests include Catherine Wetton, the Deputy Secretary of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Division, Carolyn Lambert, Co-Chair of the Victorian Collaborative Centre, Leanne Bigley, CEO of the National Centre for Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, and Claire Davies, the CEO of Shark. I would also like to extend apologies on behalf of our board chair, Michael Gorton, who unfortunately has come down with COVID this afternoon and so can't be here. This is an Auslan interpreted event, and some of you will have noticed that we have selected a different venue this year from our previous Woodcock lectures, which have been held at the Wheeler Centre. We did this because audience members gave us feedback. We wanted to ensure people had the space to stand up and move around or stretch during the event, so please feel free to do so. There are standing tables at the back of the room. Trauma is such an important topic, and we are aware that discussing trauma may cause distress for some. For those people, we have a quiet sensory room available and in-person peer support ready to help should you wish. Please approach any Wellways staff member. They all have a Wellways lanyard on who can help get you to this room should you wish. For those online, supports are accessible via the links that have been provided, and that's being put in the chat right now. Our peer helpline is operating until 9 p.m. this evening, and if you're calling after 9, please leave a message and one of our peer volunteers will get back to you tomorrow. More housekeeping. Toilets are located that way, where you came in. And in the event of an emergency, please calmly follow directions given by the Wellways staff or the State Library staff, or those announced over the PA system, and move to the external assembly area, which is actually located outside the old Melbourne Jail. And please put your mobile phones on silent. Reminder to self, yes. Now let's turn our attention to tonight's Woodcock lecture. Understand Trauma, Understand Mental Health is the title. We have 3 speakers and a subsequent panel discussion. And we would like to receive questions from the audience to direct that panel discussion. And thank you to those people who have already submitted questions. If people think of questions during the presentation or part of the lectures, they can input into Menti. Use the QR code on postcards that are on the seats or the online link that has been put in the chat. At the time of the panel discussion, we will have a roving microphone from Sophia, who is in the room. So please make yourself known if you have a question to ask. Another development for the lecture is for the first time we have a graphic recorder, and that is Debbie Wood. She will be drawing key themes that emerge during the presentations and key takeaways from tonight's lecture. And I've got to say, she must have one of the coolest jobs in the world. She travels all around Australia to events just like this to listen, make meaning, and help people tell their stories in a visual way. As Debbie creates this visual representation of our discussions on her iPad, it will be broadcast on the screen behind us and will be available to those people online. The final product will be circulated to all attendees and posted on Wellways socials after the lecture. So that's it for housekeeping. Do we have Stacey here? Yes. Fantastic. So now, before we formally begin, I'd like to introduce Stacey Piper and invite her on stage to conduct our welcome to country. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you.
You right?
Oh yeah, good, very good. Oh, thank you very, very much, and hello. It's a pleasure to be here to welcome you all to country. I've just been at my daughter's school doing a cultural awareness session and talked for an hour straight about trauma and the effects of trauma through the generations, and particularly through my family and my community. So yeah, it's fitting that I've driven down off the mountain where we live and come down here to address a room full of practitioners and people that are dedicated to maybe healing these spaces or helping bring better processes and systems into these spaces. And yeah, it's amazing work that you all do. So I know from a First Nations perspective how important it is that everyone that we interact with are trauma-informed, you know, hence my session tonight with her school teachers, because you wouldn't really think these days that school teachers need to be mental health practitioners as well, would you? But they are. They've got our future in their hands, don't they? They've got our children. And I really see how important trauma-informed practice is across all sectors and in all spaces, and obviously me as a parent breaking cycles of trauma for the next generation. So Baladun Yang Wangat, Nadanik Stacey, Wananjeri Willamik, Wananjeri Balakut, Ba Jajawarang, Ba Nulairam Warang, Mundanai Murup Gulada Bidirang, Mundanai Liwik Bolok Nuglik, Mundanai Willambik, Mundanai Tharangalpik, Wuru Bik, Mernmut Bik, Banya Bik, Bik Dui Babik Good. Ba Mundanai Bagruks, Ba Gulanya, Ba Bububs, Ba Burais, Ba Kirib, Nungojin. So that was in the Woiwurrung language. Do any of you know who the Woiwurrung language speaking people are? Are there hands of people that do? A couple? So Woiwurrung is the language that was spoken on this soil for thousands of generations, over 65,000 years they can date, but obviously much longer. That language has been woken up over a couple of generations, and I basically introduced myself. My name's Stacey. I'm a proud Wurundjeri Djadjarang and Nurala Warang woman. It's a tongue twister. And I'm also Irish. I acknowledged my ancestors, my elders, any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people in the room, all First Nations in the room, everyone in the room. We're all First Nations, aren't we, from somewhere? We all walk with our old people, our ancestors, so I acknowledge all of yours. I acknowledge the layers of country, which is linked to our value systems as Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. Those value systems that we acknowledge are improving the mental health of communities. The more that we speak them, the more that we embed them into everything we do, the more that we teach them to the next generation, and the more that we live them, because those values are about just being human and living in harmony and connection to country and nature, living with values which are about caring for country, caring for your elders, caring for each other, caring for yourself. You know, those sorts of things I think all of us as human beings can benefit from in our mental and physical well-being. We live in a beautiful part of the world. It's a beautiful, lucky country, as they say, but not for many. But we're lucky to access clean drinking water and roofs over our head and food to eat. And obviously I acknowledge all the people around the world who are suffering right now in real time. So I'll be quick, I've got another couple of minutes, but I'm a curator here at the State Library and, excuse me, I love to bring visuals. So this is just a map of Australia and this is the map of what it looked like before. So you can see that little orange spot down the bottom there above the pink, that's where we are. We're on Wurundjeri country. It's just a blip, isn't it, in the overall scheme of things, and especially in this continent alone, it's just a tiny little area of Woiwurrung-speaking people who were once 30,000 and post-invasion we went down to 18 people. And the ongoing effects from that time, which was 4 generations ago, are still very real and very present in today's community, whether it manifests through mental health issues, incarceration, suicide, child removal, deaths in custody, and the list goes on. Chronic illness. So yeah, a lot of mess to clean up, and there's a lot of great work being done. And for First Nations people, it's nice to know that there are safe spaces, hopefully, for them and people that understand them and who can understand what they bring and carry with them, because it's very recent. So the next slide, I always start with William Barak. So he was our Narangada, our headman. Then Annie Barate, his sister. So all Wurundjeri people who are left here, we come from Annie Barate. And so I always acknowledge the women whose voices were silenced and who were pretty strong to live through what they lived through for us to still be here. Then great-great-grandparents, then down to my nan and my mum. And I always acknowledge my nan and my mum because they were... Well, my nan was a black woman under the White Australia policy, so you can imagine the mental health she would have carried, but she was just such a positive person and always cracking jokes, and I think that's how she dealt with everything. But there was lots of love. You know, love really does heal and cure and keep families going, because she outlived all her siblings and she lived outside of the life expectancy. So it's amazing when you can celebrate those stories, not just the trauma. And my mum, she was born prior to the 1967 referendum. By 67, she was, where there was a resounding yes vote for Aboriginal people. She was 21 at the time, and the policies that shifted from there saw us getting more access to housing, education and healthcare. And by then, I think for mum, you know, her hopes and dreams, I think, had already been kind of dwindled away, and she had clinical depression. And I was born at the QV hospital, just here, and my birth imprint is right there, but she'd also had a stillbirth after me, but they say that undiagnosed, you know, for a lot of women, I think out of this side here, there was a lot of that undiagnosed trauma as well. So I acknowledge them, and you know, in a mental health space, like I said, it's not always doom and gloom, but we're in a space that I only have a few minutes to speak, so I might as well hit it sharp. So, you know, it's very real, drilled down to my mother. So for me and my daughter, we're, as I said, breaking cycles of oppression and all sorts of things. And yeah, I think for me personally, through ceremony, so Fenna and connection to country. So we go up and visit Corranderk regularly. That was the mission that I was talking about, that my nan was born on. We plant trees and we go dance under the mountain ash up in the forest, and we connect to the native wildlife up there. She dances and sings in her language and culture, and we do ceremony once a year. That ceremony hadn't been practiced for over 185 years, so we're 10 years in, and you can already see the healing benefits of the next generation because it's being embedded in them from babies now. So that is a key, I think, ceremony and reconnection to your values. And I'll stop there because I could be here for another 15 minutes, but I sent these slides and I was really grateful that you could play them for me because it's just a little bit deeper for me to share and welcome you all to country. So, Wenjika, Wurundjeri Balak Yamankuni, big welcome to Wurundjeri country, and thank you for listening and being present in just a little bit of my story. So, Nonggodjan, thank you.
Okay, thank you to Stacey for the generous and thought-provoking and on-topic welcome to country. That was really nice, and it was lovely to hear your family story. Really nice. I also would like to acknowledge the courage and strength of the lived experience movement. We recognise people in our communities with lived experience of mental health and those who support and walk alongside them. We acknowledge that everybody's journey is unique and valued. We recognise their strength and courage. We also respect and value their generous contributions, which teach us and guide us to continually shape, reflect upon, and deliver quality care from a lived experience perspective. Now, a little bit about the Woodcock Lecture. The Frank Woodcock Lecture is a landmark event for Wellways and the broader mental health and wellbeing system. This lecture is made possible by Frank Woodcock, who wanted to honour the memory of his son, Bruce, who lived with schizophrenia and tragically died by suicide. Frank generously approached Wellways in 1999 with a vision to challenge the stigma and discrimination surrounding mental health, to generate and inspire action from organisations to serve those most in need. The annual lecture aims to lead conversations that challenge us and our sector to innovate, improve, and embed practices that achieve our vision of an inclusive community where everyone can imagine and achieve their hopes and potential. As an organisation, we are deeply committed to realising the vision set out by the Victorian Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system and take these learnings broadly across mental health services across Australia. It is with significant disappointment then, a disappointment that I know is shared by so many in the room, that we received the recent state budget and the news that many of the substantial reforms will not be funded in the coming year. To name a few of those reforms, foundational reforms such as the establishment of the Lived and Living Experience Agency, a direct recommendation of the Royal Commission, and transformational reforms such as the development and establishment of regional mental health and wellbeing boards, and further establishment of the promised mental health and wellbeing locals across Victoria. Here at Wellways, we are committed to standing up for what we believe in, and we believe in the Royal Commission recommendations. We will continue our advocacy and commitment to ensuring that the vision of the Royal Commission remains a priority for the Victorian Government. And we respect the invaluable contribution and the stories told by those with lived experience to the Royal Commission that acknowledge the current failures of the mental health system. So on to tonight's lecture. We are gathered here with a shared goal to delve into the intricate relationships between trauma and mental health. It's not just an academic exercise, but a crucial exploration into a topic that touches the lives of countless people, families and communities. The importance of understanding trauma. Trauma, in various forms, can profoundly influence our mental health and well-being. It shapes our perceptions, behaviours, and even our physiological responses. Understanding the complex interplay between traumatic experiences and psychological well-being is therefore paramount to fostering an empathic, support-based, person-centred and kind mental health system. This year's speakers will provide us with insights into their work and insights into what must be done to bridge the gap between theory and practice, empathy and advocacy, to ensure trauma-informed practice is at the front of mental health system reform. And as we embark on this exploration, let's commit to action. Translate these insights into real change in what we do. Finally, before we commence, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speakers, organisers, and all of you for coming here. I would like to thank and acknowledge Frank and Bruce Woodcock, who generously made this lecture possible. And now, I would like to welcome our three speakers onto the stage. Thanks. Our first speaker will be known to many people in the room, Maggie Toko. Maggie is a commissioner of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission, where she brings her lived experience of mental health into her role and advocates for mental health consumers and carers. Maggie identifies as having a lived experience of schizophrenia and is a descendant of the Ngāti Whātua and Ngāpuhi tribes, who are Indigenous to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Maggie has dedicated her life and career to advocating for human rights and believes in amplifying the voices of First Nations and multicultural communities. We are indeed fortunate to hear from her tonight. Maggie.
Kia ora, everyone. Just to let you know, I'm going to read my speech. I can't memorise it because I hear voices 24/7, so I have competing audiences. So if you don't mind, I will read it. But I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting you today and which I work, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge the elders past and present and any First Nations people who are with us today. I would like to say the land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also recognise those of us who are here today with lived and living experience, and I want to honour those whose voices from the past paved a way forward against huge opposition and resistance. They never gave up. I want to recognise those of you who stand here today whose voices are bold and brave, whose passion and commitment make you mentors for generations to come. Our voices are getting louder, our actions are more profound. Collectively, we're a force to be reckoned with. Thank you, Wellways, for giving me the opportunity to tell my story from compulsory treatment to commissioner, from trauma to recovery. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maggie Toko, and I identify as a strong black queer woman. I come from Aotearoa, and my tribes are Ngāti Whātua and Ngāpuhi. I own black queer as my identity rather than see it as the negative, derogatory statement that has been thrown at me by racist people. You black bitch, and what are you doing, you coon? My first experience of racism was when I was 5 and my mother was called a nigger. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't good, and my mother's shame still resonates with me today. The other thing that impacted my life was that I was born with a stammer and I couldn't string 2 words together. This would lead me to only speak to my mother, and I was called stupid by my teachers, laughed at by other kids, and taunted by adults. I learnt not to trust. I learnt what it meant to hurt. I learnt to be silent. My mother was my saviour, and to this day I see her as my shining light at that time. When I was 12, my mother died. My father died when I was 1, and my younger sister and I were orphans. We had older brothers and sisters, some 20 years older than us, and we became wards of the state. And we shifted from one house to the next when they got sick of us. Nobody wanted us, and sometimes we would go hungry for weeks at a time. I spent a lot of my time stealing food to feed us. We had a sister who would threaten to kill us, and she would frighten us by driving the car off to the side of the road. And she would say, "You cost too much to feed," so she would stop buying food. The first time I tried to kill myself, I was 13. It wouldn't be the last time, and life was truly difficult. At 15, I left. My sister said, "You'll be back," but I never did. Instead, I went on to live with gang members who accepted me for me, who taught me to speak by stringing words together with swear words. No education, no prospects, just trying to survive. I made bad choices about relationships, and my first 2 relationships were with seriously violent women. I came out of those 2 relationships broken and with the belief that I wasn't worthy of anything better. I experienced family violence on a weekly basis, being choked and beaten, begging them to let me die, but waiting to find that I was covered in bruises till the next time. Being sorry that I had made them angry in the first place, and feeling that I had asked for it. I learned how to fight during these times, not scratching and hair pulling, but fist fighting to save my life. It taught me how to survive by sheer gut, and to this day I'm not afraid of physically defending myself. My move to Australia was difficult. I lived in a garden shed for a while, but I saw Australia as the land of opportunity. I got my first job in youth work when someone took my application off the no pile and said, "She sounds interesting, I think we should give her an interview." The job had been advertised as no experience necessarily, GLBTIQ plus encouraged, Indigenous encouraged, and I thought, I meet a few of those things, I'll give it a go. That job was the beginning of my workforce journey. I remember going to a conference in the first week down at Lawn. There were about 20 youth workers. It was all paid for, and I thought, wow, I've landed on my feet here. I was getting paid to be at a conference, getting paid to hang out with young people and make sure that they were safe. How lucky could I be? I'm mindful, though, that luck can only get you so far, and my mental health challenges were not that far away. I began to hear voices, homicidal voices, all the while continuing to work. I went on to do other jobs, pick up senior roles, managing a youth homelessness program, eventually becoming general manager of youth services for the Salvation Army Crossroads Network. I went on to study law at Melbourne Uni, and that proved to be the icing on the cake for my mental health. While there, I started to get messages on the computer, and my dog started talking to me, telling me to kill the kids next door, telling me that red number plates meant I was being followed, and that I should run them off the road, beat them up, and kill them if I had a chance. It culminated in me being admitted to an acute unit, where I was placed in high division and sectioned for 3 months. I thought my world as I had known it would end, and my partner at first was relieved that I was in hospital. She had battled through my threats of violence against her, our son, and our animals for so long. They were not exempt from my paranoia, from my homicidal thoughts. She became frustrated when it became obvious that we were no longer in charge of what was happening to me. I was in the hospital system, and psychiatrists would make the final decisions. That initial stay would turn into 10 years of in and out of hospital, at least 4 times a year. The whole time this happened, I worked. I was given redundancy from the salvos. They didn't know how to treat my unwellness, and I went from there to 2 days a fortnight doing resi work. I called a friend at the Western Region Health Centre, which would become CoHealth, and said I needed a job and could she help. They found work for me. Over 4 years I would go from 2 days a fortnight to 3, 7, 9, and finally full-time in resi care. I stayed there for 15 years, and when I left I was manager of their 3 residential services. My time during those years was dispersed with hospital stays, different medication regimes, from Seroquel to Tagamet, Zoloft, olanzapine, Risperidol to clozapine. The last one nearly killed me and I ended up with a heart murmur. I wondered if my story would ever change, but my story was just beginning, but my psychiatrist's message stayed the same. Work is too much for you. Give it up and go on the DSP. I thought, fuck you, I'm better than you will ever know. During this tumultuous time, I started seeing a psychotherapist, and she and I would work together for 18 years. My partner made sure to plan a budget for my sessions, otherwise we could not have afforded it. I learnt so much about myself during those sessions, unpacked the trauma I had lived through, gave myself permission to hurt, permission to excel, and permission to live. I finished with Anne in 2018, and I gave her a card which said she was one of the essential ingredients in my recovery, her, my beautiful partner, and my work. I went from managing resi services to being CEO of Vimiac. It really was a life-changing time for me. I always knew I was meant to fight for those who were less fortunate, fight for those who, like me, never had a voice, fight for those who were denied their rights. Vimiac proved to be the place where I could do all of that. I was part of Vimiac for 5 years, and we went from 7 staff to 25, from a budget of $785,000 to $5 million, and since that time it has expanded even greater. So I stand here today as Consumer Commissioner. I've been on the depot injection for 10 years. I still hear homicidal voices 24/7. I see flashes of videos at 5-minute intervals of murder and mayhem. I don't read fiction except Harry Potter and John Grisham because I get messages in the text. I don't read newspapers or watch TV and movies. I go to the movies, but I rarely stay beyond the opening as I get messages there as well. I don't see a psychiatrist anymore. In later years, as I climbed the leadership ladder, I would come across his name as attending one of my many meetings. He never showed, and I can only guess that he saw my name down as well. I began my commissioner journey as Deputy Commissioner of the Mental Health Complaints Commission. I did this for 2 years, and I never thought I could ever be a manager, general manager, deputy commissioner, or commissioner. What I can say is that I never gave up hope that my life could be different. I've been lucky to have people who believed in me, who stuck by me, had faith in me. I had mentors who are still in my life today, and leaders who raised me up, who showed me the way to see my own potential. The trauma I experienced in childhood from losing my parents, but primarily my mother, lives with me today. During the 10 years I spent in and out of acute units, at the time I thought it defined who I was. I kept going to work though, and that was really my saviour. I had an employer who engaged with me in my recovery by making sure that my work role was secure every time I went to hospital, that I would work as little or as much as I needed, that I had a regular wage coming in so I could pay my mortgage. I worked for them for 15 years, and they saw the worst and best parts of me over that time. I had a partner who persisted in keeping me balanced, who minded our child and animals and maintained our home when I couldn't. I spent years sleeping 3 hours a night and having my days feeling so exhausted, but still I managed to work. At one point in my recovery, I had 3 jobs: 4 days at the Resi rehab with young people, 1 day as a consumer consultant, and 2 nights as a teacher at RMIT, teaching the diploma in alcohol and other drugs and mental health. That job would eventually lead to 5 years teaching the diploma in the Northern Territory to Indigenous students on the fly in 1 week every 2 months. My full-time job allowed me to do that, and the flexibility in my choices enabled me to learn and grow and ultimately recover enough to continue making positive choices. I've learned through my working life that, like mental health, trauma is one component of who you are. One of the major things I learned when working with young people was the importance of holding hope for them in my mind when they couldn't hold it for themselves, and sharing silent space with them. Just sitting in silence until they were ready to talk, not doing what most workers do, which is fill the space with words and solutions. Young people, consumers, don't get enough time to think about what they want. I'm very grateful to all the young people I worked with who shared their space with me. I was very fortunate to have experienced that, and many I still see today. They are now mums and dads, some have mortgages, all have work, and they live the best life they can. While working with young people, I would use an analogy for trauma, and still today I use it to explain to consumers who don't have a voice how to get a voice. What I explain is that when you experience trauma, it's like having a suitcase that the zip is open for every year you've experienced trauma and hurt. So if you're 17, it's possible that you have 17 suitcases, all open, all spilling out trauma. If this is the case, how in your mind can you find space and freedom to think clearly, to make decisions about how you will live, what you will eat, if you will sleep? I would explain that I, as a worker, could assist them to get to a stage where maybe some of the suitcases could be zipped up, could be closed, so that not so much trauma was spilling out. That they might get to a stage where they could open and close them when they wanted and needed to, that they would have the power over the suitcases, power over the trauma. I acknowledge that there would be times when we wanted the suitcases open, times when we were feeling so much pain that we had no power over the suitcases, but at that time we can get to a stage of closing them, of silencing them, so that we could make decisions which enhance our lives on a daily basis. In using this analogy, young people really got it. They would often talk about when they were open and closed. They learned to feel emotions again, to be angry. I've always said anger is a good emotion. The action when they are angry is to channel that into positive responses. Be loud, yell out, even smash a glass. Just don't smash yourself or someone else. I realise too that there may be some people here tonight whose suitcases are open, whose pain is real, and I want you to know that I get you. You're not alone. But step by step, your suitcases can be closed. They can be silenced. I agree there is no quick fix. Understanding the control they have and learning to take the power back will assist towards a recovery that can be wonderful. I realise that in my work life with people, with consumers, that I only need to do enough as a pebble because collectively we will make a rock. I hope that I too can lead by example, and every young person who is struggling with their voice, struggling with their life, should be told, you too can aspire to be anything you want to be in life. Being on a community treatment order shouldn't dictate your future. It is not the sum of who you are. You are only ever one step away from listening to your heart, opening yourself up to positive influences, and grabbing the goodness that life has to offer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I'd now like to introduce Kerry Hawkins as our second speaker. Kerry brings a family and carer perspective this evening. Many of you will also know Kerry. Kerry holds several key roles with mental health advocacy and in support organisations. She serves as Vice Chair of Mental Health Carers Australia, a board member of Psychosis Australia Trust, and a board member of Helping Minds. Kerry is also co-chair of Wellways Lived and Living Experience Authority. She recently undertook the Churchill Scholarship, exploring the crucial roles of families in mental health, and brings a wealth of experience and expertise to the subject of trauma. Thank you, Kerry.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Stacey, for that wonderful welcome as well. And hello, everybody. I'm bringing a family perspective. I'm deliberately calling it family, not carer, and I'll go into some of those reasons why. And I just also want to acknowledge that trauma and families is a really complex topic. So I'm going to be navigating some delicate spaces here tonight. In doing that, I just want to also acknowledge that I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here. Pay my respects to elders here, First Nations people around Australia, and any First Nations people in the room tonight. And also, like Laura, recognise people with lived experience here in the room, and that we stand on the shoulders of giants of the lived experience movement going back decades, all holding the same narrative of trauma. Maggie's one of them. But also importantly, recognise that I'm not talking on behalf of people with personal lived experience. As a family member, obviously, I've experienced my fair share of trauma, but also families have had a history of speaking on behalf of people with lived experience. But in doing so, also acknowledge the work and the impact of trauma on families, and note that Frank, a family member, has created this opportunity, and Wellways was created by families, as were many peaks and organisations around Australia. Most of the NGO sector has been founded by families living with the consequences of a broken, violent, ineffective mental health system. But in recognising that I have lived experience, I'm also recognising that I'm a white, cis, middle-class family member. I haven't had to navigate some of the difficult spaces of the alcohol and other drugs system. I haven't had to navigate the criminal justice system that many families in my position have had to navigate. And most importantly, as Stacey highlighted, I haven't had to navigate the experiences of dispossession and the ripple effects of intergenerational trauma that sit with First Nations people, and that they have quite a different definition of lived experience. I'm very conscious of what I'm bringing and what I'm not bringing tonight, and give a shout out to Auntie Vicky McKenna, who runs the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Lived Experience Centre, who does so much work in holding so much sorrow, so much trauma, up in the Kimberley and Broome, where she's based, in Galimabu. Okay, so this photo that you probably can't read, the front of it actually sits at the very, very entrance of the World Health Organization in Geneva. When I went there for my Churchill Fellowship, it's the first thing that you see when you enter the building. And it's a picture of a family as one unit. And it's the writing on it talks about the sacredness and the solidarity of the family unit. And very, very often in mental health, because we are often divided into consumers and carers, the family gets lost, and I'm deliberately bringing the family unit into this conversation, including the voices of children whose voices are very, very rarely heard in these conversations. And also acknowledge that it can be a very, very difficult space. Families are the sources of trauma as well. There are systemic and structural drivers behind those reasons, but it's important to acknowledge that for many people in the personal lived experience movement, families can be a very, very problematic space to talk about. So I've just very briefly tried to highlight it, and we can move around all of these quadrants, but the presence of families can be good, the presence of families can be bad, the absence of families can be good, and the absence of families can be bad. But even more complexity, families are deeply, deeply impacted, viscerally, physically, emotionally and financially by their distressed and unsupported family member. So I know many, many families who have been harmed deeply by people living with distress. And we don't talk about that so much because we tiptoe around it. We don't want to buy into the stereotypes of violence, but many, many families are actually living with incredible distress. But just as importantly, we are deeply, deeply impacted by the exploitation and neglect of a violent and an ineffective mental health system and social services system. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And families' social, economic and cultural rights are not protected by our policies and systems. One of the deepest harms done to families by our mental health system is the destruction of relationships very often because of the medical system, and I'll talk about that a bit more. And that is a right, to have good, productive, healthy relationships with family members. Okay, so with all of that preliminary positioning out of the way, I'm going to talk about a few things tonight, and I'm only going to talk about our personal family story a little bit. I knew that Maggie would cover it fairly well. As a family member, it's not my story to tell quite often. I'm also holding the narratives of my family, and so I'm very conscious about what I do and don't say. But I am also going to build in some other stories as well, because this conversation we're having tonight is part of a bigger story that we're all sharing that's a political story. And so I want to break it down into 3 stories from the past and then a couple of stories, one from the present, one from the future. So story number 1, our family story. This is a picture here. I didn't particularly want to use photos, but this is a picture that was drawn by our middle child, Freddie, at the kitchen table one night when my husband had gone missing for a suicide attempt. One of many, many. As is a family story of... and I don't really like to buy into the medical paradigm necessarily. It hasn't been helpful for our family. But like Maggie, he had a background as being a ward of the state, experienced significant abuse in and out of the ward of the state experiences, saw many horrendous violent things, experienced many horrendous violent things, went for days without food as well. I won't go into the details, but it's a trauma backstory. And so, of course... no surprises that he ended up, once we started having children of our own, with experiences that would be called, under the medical paradigm, paranoid schizophrenia, and like Maggie lives with homicidal command voices and has done for many, many years. But it's a story of intergenerational trauma. His mother was a single mother, bringing up 5 boys on her own in poverty. He witnessed suicide attempts from her as well. So one of the other experiences that we've had as well that is traumatic is ongoing medical understandings and harmful interventions. So like all families, we went to the health system starting with a GP and ending up in the various acute and mental health wards for many, many years. Same story as Maggie. Lots of medications, risperidone, olanzapine, Seroquel, clozapine. Also nearly killed my husband with a deep vein thrombosis, but was also a weapon of choice for one of his suicide attempts when he was afraid that he was going to be hospitalised again. In New Zealand, one of the many inquiries held there talked about the cruelty in the system of being encouraged to seek help from our system but not being able to find it. So we went back over and over and over and over and over again asking for help from many systems and only found harm. We were fortunate to encounter one trauma peer at one time, one of the pioneers of the Hearing Voices movement, Ron Coleman, and he and his wife Karen spent some time with my husband overseas, and that was enough to put a bit of a circuit breaker into his experiences of distress. And through some work, we're able to get him to the point where he's not needed medication for many, many years now. He still hears voices, they're still command voices, but he's also doing a PhD on artificial intelligence and the future of consciousness, so he's able to, like Maggie, fight through the voices. We also experienced other kinds of trauma. I think sometimes trauma in 15 minutes is just a huge conversation. We can't begin to unpack the various forms of trauma, but we also experienced unresponsive systems, extreme poverty. We went from having 2 six-figure salaries to 0. With an unresponsive social service system, I can feel it whenever I have to engage with Centrelink. The incredible experiences of poverty and complete rejection of any kind of help as a family member. And I discovered along the way that I was apparently a carer as well, which was not how I was feeling at the time. I was just barely struggling to survive. And I think without my own family, and I'm surprised and delighted that my sister's here tonight, which is very unusual because I live on Wajak Noongar Budja, so don't very often come to Victoria to do this kind of work. But without my family supporting me, I probably would not have survived. We were seconds away from headlines of all kinds, many, many times. And this went on for years and years and years. We've only just started to come out of it. And again, wouldn't have done it without informal supports of my family and my friends. It was not because of the system. So that's my personal story, or a bit of it. The second story I want to talk about is the broader trauma story, or the narrative. And mental health in some ways is a bit of a battle of narratives, and I think that's the conversation we need to have. So collectively, within the lived experience movement, this notion of trauma has been around since asylums were closed and people were able to start getting organised. And so this pamphlet up here is from roughly 1972, and it's the first Mental Patients Union pamphlet. And it's called the Fish pamphlet, and the importance of it is that people with lived experience were trying to explain that people might look and act and behave strangely, but it's because of the pain that they've been enduring. And all of the other fish around see this fish that's acting very, very strangely. They don't see the hook. So trauma is invisible, and it makes people respond and behave in different ways. So this has been a collective understanding, lived experience expertise for over 50 years. The other part around trauma that's been part of the narrative, if you like, but hasn't really hit our systems, is this language around social determinants and structural violence. So many of you be aware of the work that Sir Michael Marmot's been doing for over a decade now through the World Health Organization on social determinants. Interestingly, the language around structural violence has been around for quite some time as well. Mostly in the last 5-10 years it's been supplanted by social determinants. We don't refer to it so much as violence, but it is an experience of violence. And as part of the trauma story, families have often been problematised as well, and so there was this understanding of a refrigerator mother being the cause of schizophrenia at one time. And in and amongst all of these trauma concepts, interestingly, much of this work, the disruptive, groundbreaking work, has come from a collective group of people who've also been oppressed in and of themselves. So the seminal piece of work that really kind of broke open and defined trauma as we understand it today by Judith Herman, talking about how people can recover from trauma, positioning distress as a trauma experience. Miranda Fricker, epistemic injustice. Most of you will be aware of the extreme imbalances of power around the construction of knowledge. The ladder of citizenship, most of you will know that is really sort of the genesis of what we're now calling co-production, another female pioneer, and of course intersectionality by an African-American female, Kimberlé Crenshaw. So these are all kind of conceptually floating around the place in the history and the discourse and the story of trauma. We just haven't found a way yet to integrate and organise and take over our mental health system and other systems with it, but they've been around for a long time. This is another example as it has started to move into mainstream. This is from The Lancet, I think 2019, starting to really work through and understand and unpack the social determinants, as they called them. But in other words, trauma. So these are the proximal and distal factors that they've identified, including things such as racism, including bullying and so on. They don't talk so much about relationships and abuse, but these broader experiences of intersectionality, as Kimberley Crenshaw would call them, are all experiences of trauma and expressions of violence. Within our systems, we have structurally violent health systems. So this is a piece of work done by Professor Sharon Friel at ANU, who identifies that our systems, a bit like our society, our communities, is bathed in these expressions of violence, whether it's capitalism, neoliberalism, sexism, colonisation and so on. But our systems themselves are actually structured around experiences of violence as well. The third story I just want to touch on very briefly is the system story that has worked alongside the mental health system, that's kind of sat alongside for the last 50 or so years as well, all of us. And this is the story that our current system is safe, scientific, effective and benevolent, and any attempts to shift this are seen as unsafe and unscientific. And consumer survivors are very often problematised as being either anti-psychiatry or disruptive in some way or another. It's a very powerful story. The other story that goes along with this is that we have treatments that work, we just need more resources to implement them better. And the other story, of course, is that we are a trauma-informed system, that we are a family-inclusive system, we are person-centred, we are biopsychosocial in our approaches, and we just need more resources to work at top of scope. And this is the dominant narrative that still works in our system and holds the system from being truly reformed. So now I want to flick over to the present. And in doing so, I'm going to flick over from being an experiencer, which is why I'm up here. People have been invited to tell their stories for many years. Storytelling is believed to be the way that we can shift the system. Telling your story makes people feel compassion and pity and empathy, and I, like many families and many consumers, have been telling our story for many years. I thought that was probably what you did when you got your head above water. All you had to do was tell the truth. All you had to do was tell your story. All you had to do was say, actually, for the system to be fit for purpose and meet our needs, this is what you need to do, but it doesn't work like that. So in the last decade or so, there's been a movement for people to be, with lived experience, to shift from being objects of compassion, objects of pity sometimes. They're very non-threatening positions to be in, to positions of expert and professionalising the lived experience movement, because this, I've discovered, is political. It's not as straightforward as demanding that a service is designed to fit your needs. I've been doing that for 10 years or more, along with many other individuals, and it doesn't work. In fact, what we've seen still is that there is a persistent failure in state capability for implementing reform, and Laura spoke to an example of that in the state budget recently. Our federal budget was just announced last week, and it was a celebration of biomedicalism. Reform, and genuine reform that we can all agree is reform, is very, very difficult to implement, and I have yet to see any of our governments signal that they are interested in genuine reform. Another story is that families have become carers. So really, before deinstitutionalisation, families weren't carers. We've become this policy setting, if you like, because families agitated to be recognised for the work they do. But effectively, we've been responsibilised in the system. Hundreds of thousands of families, full-time, have given up their work, sacrificed their careers because of the failure of the system. And so I'm very, very reluctant, even though my life has been completely thrown upside down because of our experiences as a family. I don't want to let the government off the hook. If you're a family member, you exist and I'm here because the system has failed. Psychosocial disability is another example of some rebranding or a new policy setting that we've now moved from calling it complex mental illness to psychosocial disability. It's just something that's rebadged. Effectively what it is, people have not been served or cured by the system. So really they're just rebadged policy settings from a system failure. This is a classic example of how the system works for family members. So this has come from someone in the UK, and we call it, it's a thought-terminating cliche. So these are the things you do when the aim is to suppress and oppress people from agitating. So we've all been now really acculturated into believing that we are heroic family members, and that we have these annual carers weeks where we effectively get given the equivalent of thoughts and prayers. I'm not up for that. That's not what we want at all. This legitimises the experiences of families, and I think we need to be a whole lot more political and disruptive. So then this is my story for the future. And I think if you need to understand trauma, actually you need to understand violence. One of the risks of working in a trauma-informed system is that yet again we are putting the onus on individuals to recover, to heal from trauma. We are not putting our focus on the violence that is creating trauma in people. I want to introduce this concept of vicarious resistance for practitioners. So again, in a system that's not going to reform itself, we are putting people into positions of transactional sessions with people where we work with them to heal. There are other ways of healing, and we don't want to necessarily legitimise yet again another way of working with people that is still medicalising people and still missing the point of using other ways for people to heal. One of the major issues we have is that people exist in profoundly toxic circumstances still. There are other ways of healing, as Maggie highlighted, through relationships and work. So let's not risk just embedding yet another way of conceptualising things that people with lived experience have wanted, like like recovery, like person-centredness, like co-design. They've all been co-opted. I think there's a tremendous risk, if we're not thoughtful and careful about how we go about understanding trauma, that it will just become another feature of the existing system. And of course, as we professionalise the lived experience workforce, basically these are people who are walking individual units of trauma, and we're putting them into what we're calling multidisciplinary settings or groups in a monolithic medical model most of the time still, and there are significant dangers around not doing this work carefully and thoughtfully. So there is a story that we can write together, and I want to highlight a piece of work done last year. This was an output of the Royal Commission called Not Before Time, and it was a recording of the harms done to people, families and individuals, and advice to the Minister for how to embark on a process of restorative justice. The report was buried, of course. But I think we can practice some new ways of thinking. And so to start, I want you to, you're all familiar with this poem, I'm sure, and you've all probably got all kinds of ways of innovatively thinking about how to finish this one off. I'm going to offer a new one that I think maybe will help us start to think about things differently. So roses are red and violets are blue. Finish this poem yourself, you dependent parasite. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kerry. And now I'd like to introduce Jane Nursey as our third speaker. Jane is the Head of Clinical Services at Phoenix Australia and a clinical neuropsychologist. She has devoted her life to developing and implementing trauma-informed service models, training programs, and providing policy and service development advice to a range of organisations, state and Commonwealth Government departments. She coordinated a treatment service for bushfire survivors following the Victorian bushfires in February 2009 and has since published on the bushfires' impacts on children and adolescents. I invite Jane to the stage.
Just work out how to... Is it just press the green button?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I'd just like to thank Wellways for inviting Phoenix and myself along tonight to speak at this event. It's a really important conversation, and I'm really pleased that we are going to be part of it. I would also just like to acknowledge the lands that we are on and the Wurundjeri people as the original owners of this land, unceded lands, and the importance of their continued role in the unique life of the lands. I'm going to talk to you a bit about trauma-informed care and what trauma-informed care is, but first of all I want to put in context where I am coming from that. So a bit about myself first. I grew up in a family where trauma was present. My father was a World War II vet who'd suffered significant injury during the war. My grandparents were World War I vets with a lot of loss in their families around that. And my grandfather on my father's side got a life-threatening illness following the flu epidemic. And that put the family into poverty, and my father was forced to then leave school and help support the family. And so there was generational impacts, I guess, of that. I also grew up in a family with a number of siblings, a couple of which who have fairly significant mental health problems, and so supporting them through trying to access appropriate care and ride the ups and downs of what chronic mental illness is. I started working I was interested in psychology. I started working as a clinical neuropsychologist in the public mental health system. And for many years, as a low-level psychologist in the mental health system, sitting in case meetings, feeling really frustrated at the lack of understanding or lack of acknowledgement of the person as a whole. Often, particularly in the adult system, there was very little mention of the life history of the person in front of us. There was very little mention or understanding of whether or not they'd had any trauma in their lives. Given that the majority of people in the mental health system do have trauma in their lives, it seemed to not make sense to me that wasn't something that was discussed, because in the end, what you're doing by ignoring the developmental history, by ignoring the trauma history of people, is you're not treating the person, you're treating a symptom, or you're treating what's in front of you at the time, a behaviour perhaps. So that led to some frustration over time, and I started getting more interested in trauma and moving to working in that area. In the meantime, I had worked in child and adolescent, in adult and aged arenas, where I was being tasked sometimes to set up a new service or a new program within those services. And was really forced to think about, well, what are the criteria really for being able to treat and support people holistically. At Phoenix Australia, we're a not-for-profit organisation whose mission is to improve the lives of people with trauma. We have 4 arms of work. We do a lot of research into understanding trauma and identifying better ways to treat trauma. We do a lot of policy and service development work with government and industry and communities around spreading the word about trauma and its impacts and how to improve the support of people who've been impacted by trauma, how workplaces can be more trauma-informed. We do a lot of training and education of health and mental health clinicians around the evidence-based treatments for trauma. And we run a small clinical service, which is what I am in charge of at the moment. And that service was about setting up services for emergency service workers and really starting to build from scratch a clinical service, having the opportunity to work with the agencies of the emergency service workers themselves, have their input into that, work with the other agencies around that were supporting their mental health, and start to try and build a service that was actually going to be, hopefully, more trauma-informed. So I will now just move on to talking about trauma-informed care and what we understand, or what I, perhaps coming from a clinician and academic point of view, understand that to be. And if we look at the sort of origins of where this started to be spoken about, particularly in the mental health field, this quote from Hopper's Bassett and Oliver perhaps were some of the first thinkers in this area. So trauma-informed care is a strength-based framework. It's grounded in the understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma. It emphasises physical, psychological and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, and that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. It's an important statement, but it's actually quite a complex statement that needs to be unpacked quite a bit. To simplify it, an alternative... Sorry, I'm going backwards. How do I go forwards? Way. Perhaps a framework for service delivery that aims to ensure that people with a history of trauma have safe and positive experiences of service delivery, and that care is provided in ways that create opportunities for healing and growth. What do we mean exactly by that? There are a number of aims in trauma-informed care. One is we try to minimise any trauma-related barriers to accessing and engaging with services. Is the service a safe place for the person to come into? Are there things, even in the physical presence of the service, that are going to re-traumatise a person before they even get inside it? Are the people going to be able to understand them and listen to them? What's the front end of the service saying to the person when they first front up? We want to minimise potential harms from service delivery. We want to provide services that support hope and self-determination and prioritise safety and well-being. So this is a diagram, I guess, about how we conceptualise the concept of trauma-informed care and the principles, and how what you might need to think about as you go about offering trauma-informed services. So the first one is to be trauma-aware and culturally responsive. There is a large, or maybe I'll put it the other way, there's a small percentage of people working in the mental health system and the related services who have a really thorough understanding of trauma and its impacts. Despite 75% of the population experiencing trauma at some point in our lifetime, the education around what trauma does to a human being in physical, emotional, cognitive, spiritual ways is really lacking. And so it's very hard often to find a service that has a true, deep understanding of those impacts of trauma and how to manage that, how to approach a person, how to work with a person who has trauma in their background. The other key point is being culturally responsive, culturally aware and culturally responsive. Everybody comes in from their own cultural background, whether that be their family culture background, whether it be their gender, their orientation, their workplace, their origin. The person is more than one culture, and you really need to understand where that person's coming from to be able to work in a trauma-informed way with them. So it's really incumbent upon the worker to be investigating as much as possible the background of the person, understand all the nuances of their culture and what they're bringing in with them. And you need to be responsive to what that culture, what those cultures need in working with them. It's important to build safety and trust. We know that trauma erodes trust and makes people feel unsafe. A priority for a trauma-informed care service is to provide as much safety around the person as possible. And that does mean asking them, what is it they need to feel safe whilst they're in your service, whilst you're working with them? How do I set up the room? What are the questions that I need to avoid or the language I need to avoid using? What are the different ways that we can work together that might make you feel safer rather than sitting in a chair and talking? Trust is something that builds over time. Our mental health system often is, particularly if it's working from a medicalisation point of view, is a brief 15-minute session where medications are reviewed. It doesn't give a great opportunity for building trust. Really important that that gets accounted for. Giving choice and control. The other thing that trauma does is take away choice. It takes away a sense of control. So rebuilding that into the approach of working with people who've been traumatised is important. Focusing on the strengths. Someone who's been through a trauma does not believe that they have any strengths. They've lost their faith in their own abilities to survive, to support themselves. They've lost sight of whatever achievements they've had previously. So really important to bring the focus back onto their strengths and work with those. Facilitating connections. Another thing that happens with people who've been traumatised is that they become disconnected from the world around them. Often as a way of protecting themselves, but also because they can no longer relate to people in the same way as they used to be able to, and people find it very difficult to relate to them as well. So building an environment where connections can be reformed and where a ability to be able to form those connections and maintain those connections is prioritised. And then fostering a belief in recovery is also important. We've heard that, often people who've been traumatised or living with mental health problems really do lose a sense of ever recovering, ever getting over what has happened to them and what is going on with them. So really important to foster that belief in recovery. So what are the sorts of things that are important to include in a trauma-informed mental health care system? First is equity of access. We have a system that it's actually very difficult to get into. And that's because, A, of funding, but B, also because it's very geared towards particular types of mental health disorders and particular people as well. So really having a much more equitable system that is easy to access and that is coordinated with other services. Our services work in silos. There's very little communication that happens between them. So a person will go in one door and tell their story, be sent into it through another door and have to tell their story again, and so on. That is a way of re-traumatising a person, so having a coordinated service is really important. Cross-sector awareness, making sure that all parts of the system are aware of how those different parts operate and how do we get the person that we're working with access to those parts of the system that they need. There needs to be a lot more communication and cooperation and partnership between the different services. Skilled, trauma-informed and culturally aware workforces. We need to get everyone educated about trauma and how it impacts people. If we don't do that, we can't have a trauma-informed system. So a fundamental is really that education piece. We need to be working and learning from and using the lived experience of people to design the systems and to show us how to work in a trauma-informed way. If our workers are coming from a stance of not having had that experience, it's very difficult for them to understand what the priorities need to be. So that co-design, working collaboratively and collectively is really important. There needs to be a stepped care service model, not one size fits all. There need to be different levels of service provision with people getting matched to the level of care that they need and being given direct and easy access to that level of care with the option of moving up or down the ladder depending on their service needs. And that needs to be a seamless and easy movement for them. There need to be care coordinators or service navigators that can help shepherd the person through that system process so that they're not left on their own wondering, how do I get help? How do I get the care that I need? How do I get into that service? Why aren't I eligible for this? There needs to be someone who can help oversee that and provide the support required. And finally, there needs to be care that does have an evidence base for it and that is driven by, is evaluated and driven by measurement to show that it's actually having an impact and leading to improvement. Unfortunately, the majority of people that get care don't improve from it. And there are multiple reasons for that, but without being able to measure what we're doing and how we're doing it, we're at a loss to know how to improve it. So it's really important that that evaluation and evidence-driven approach is a priority. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane.
Okay, so we've had three different perspectives, I think, about trauma, the impact of trauma, and some practical examples from Jane about how we can better respond to people and experiences of trauma. Now, our plan is to move into a brief panel discussion, which unfortunately is going to have to be brief because I had no intention of interrupting the speakers who were so compelling. So I'm going to ask the starting question and then perhaps we'll have time to take one or two questions from the audience here. And Maggie, I'm going to ask you to respond first and then perhaps Kerry and Jane. The question is, why is it so important, why, that we shift from a treatment system to a healing system. All three speakers have used the word healing when speaking about trauma and how a system or a response could improve. So why is it so important? Maggie?
It's an interesting one. I think, for a start, treatment is to consumers, and I won't speak for all consumers, but for a majority of consumers, the word treatment refers to compulsory treatment. So we hate that word, hate everything that goes with it, the terms medical model. I think, I know it needs to shift. It needs to shift to healing, and healing that's holistic, that has the wraparound service for consumers, that where you can go to a clinician or an alternative an alternative choice of care where somebody listens and hears you and actually is available for you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's all consumers want. They want a choice in who they see. They want a choice in how they receive care, and they want it to be equal and certainly trauma-informed. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Maggie. Kerry?
Yeah, thanks. For me, I think it's a conceptual difference that makes all the difference. So treatment, the word comes with connotations around fixing a deficit. It's slightly misanthropic, I think. It treats people as walking diseases because we're talking about people's identities and who people are. So it frames people in a certain way that opens them up to stigma, discrimination, and then, of course, when the treatments don't work, that's the other issue I have with the word, it connotes success. So then they are rendered sometimes defective, sometimes violent, but it's a highly problematic word. Healing, on the other hand, connotes a sense of having something happen to you, some kind of injuries, violence, that's not your fault, and has a sense of restorativeness to it as well, that I think is a lot more personal, a lot less blamey, and does speak to the context into which people are living. So there is a sense of something having happened to people. It's the old saying, I guess, instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what's happened to you. And it has that kind of sense to it, yeah.
Thanks, Kerry. Shane, can you respond to the question?
Yeah, so look, I think I probably agree with Kerry to a certain extent. I think that treatment does denote the idea of something being done to the person rather than a healing of the whole person. But I think it is about your definitions, and I think, healing often can't happen without some form of therapy or treatment. And it's how that treatment is delivered, I think, that's really important. We know that a third of people who receive evidence-based treatments won't respond to them. A third will do very well, and a third will get some improvement but will still maintain a diagnosis. So we don't yet have the right answers to what treatments are. But we do know that people who do well in treatment and people who feel that they begin to heal are those ones that are feel engaged with the person that they're working with, feel understood by the person that they're working with, feel safe and trusted, have trust in the person that they're working with. And so I think that those aspects of care what is healing. And those are the things that I think we need to get more embedded into the system, find a way to make sure that everyone who goes through the door has a chance of being able to feel heard, feel safe, have trust in the person that they're working with, and feel like they're getting what they need in the treatment that's being delivered, or the care that's being delivered.
And may I ask one follow-up question before I go to the audience, because it's on the tip of my tongue. So, Kerry, I'm going to ask you this question, and then maybe Maggie. So, Jane's answer was talking about how the system and how clinicians work with people who walk through a door seeking some sort of treatment or healing. The question I'd like to pose, or the conversation starter, is, can healing, as we're conceptualising it, does it happen in a system? Does it have to happen in a constructed system, that being a mental health system?
I mean, no. I think on my slide I talked a little bit to what we call relational recovery, which again reconceptualises recovery as a much more dynamic process between people rather than between their ears. I think for our family in particular, it happened outside of the system. It happened through relationships. It happened through meaningful things to do. Maggie talked to work, I think employment. So environment healing, I think, is experiential. And providing more opportunities for those kinds of healing experiences doesn't have to happen in the system. In fact, I think what we know from the recovery literature, Mike Slade and others talk about, actually we shouldn't have a mental health system, we should all be social agents of change. Relationships are probably the single most powerful healing agent.
Which sort of echoes something of what Jane was saying, that relationships are the key thing that happens in the system, I think, as it is, that can be helpful. Maggie, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, for me, my healing happened because I had a fantastic GP who really listened and heard me, and who I had for a number of years. I had a fantastic psychotherapist. I had a gorgeous partner who just stuck by me no matter what happened. I had a workplace that supported me.
Wow.
I had all the components were together.
Yeah.
So a real wraparound service for me. So I was very lucky. So it was, and I agree with Kerry about the relationships. So I had all that, and then I had my psychiatrist saying the same story. So, and his story wasn't my story. So, but I did have a wraparound service that was really good.
Fantastic. Okay, have we got any questions from the audience? Sophie is there with the microphone. Or comments? Anna, I was very surprised you weren't going to do such a thing, so thank you.
I can't help myself because I'm really angry and I'm really infuriated by some of the stuff that's come up, because I think my question really is around, do we really have a model that we can offer our consumers and families around healing? Because the dominant medical model has contributed to a world that discredits people who do offer alternatives and do offer healing. We often silence people, and we silence communities, and we systematically discredit people who offer healing in different ways. And I think that my question is, if we want healing, what are we willing to let go of you know, what are we willing to put aside? How far are we actually willing to stand up and try something different? Because if only a third of people are actually getting a real benefit from the treatment that we're offering, that's not good enough. But if we keep going back to that model and expecting it to give us an answer, then I mean, we know the Einstein quote. It's, you know, we haven't tried something new. So what could we do that's different? What could we do that's new, that doesn't discredit other voices or other alternatives or modes of healing?
Thanks, Anna. Is there a panellist that would like to respond to Anna?
Yeah, so it's that story that I put up there, the current, safe and effective, right? You know, so like, and it's so, this is where it's political. So the World Health Organization 4 or 5 years ago put out a guidance to services in the community that are person-centred, recovery-oriented, rights-based healing models. Things like the grandmother's bench in Zimbabwe, for example, real out of the box from all around the world. Australia wasn't in it. There was not a single example from Australia out of all of the countries in the world. So we are particularly conservative about the way we go about doing things. I think we have a long way to go, so we might kind of live in a bit of a sector bubble where we all know what's needed. I think the Australian population and the discourse out there in the community is still one of capture. They trust in chemical imbalance stories. They believe that you go to the GP, you get a pill, or you go to your 10 or 20 better access. And that, of course, is supported from within the system by service providers. We have I don't think we talk about it enough, but we have a conflict of interest, a serious lobbying industry that impacts on decision makers in our system. So the people that have access to politicians and therefore the flow of funding, service providers. And so I think, you know, we have a very, very long way to go. We can't rely on the broader Australian community to back us in on this one. Things like the lived experience workforce, lived experience leadership probably are going to have to do some of that work. But the other complexity to it is that much of this work is cross-portfolio. So we have to invest in other areas, not just reform the health system. And the other complexity to this is that this is going to take a long time to build. A lot of the returns will be intergenerational, for example. So I completely agree with you, Anna, but I think we have to think about how we operate in a more politically savvy way as well, because all of the forces of the establishment are very invested in keeping the status quo. And I don't think we can underestimate that.
My anger comes from a place of having personally had to take responsibility for my own life and do more than what the medical model offered me, including alternatives, in order to give myself the best quality of life that I can have. And I see people struggling in the system, and I know that there's so much more that we could offer people, that we could be doing, but we're so... I think we're stuck in this evidence-based idea. All change comes from something new and something small, and we won't always have the exact amount of answers or evidence before we get to the place of being able to give, to learn something new, to do something new. So thanks, because my anger comes from my own frustration of having to try my own path. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Teslas or Ubers weren't evidence-based when they were innovated, but we just don't do innovation in mental health. Agree.
Yeah. Jane, I feel like you are itching.
I feel I need to respond to that in some way. I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think there is a reliance upon the person having to find out for themselves the other things they need to do if they're not getting what they need from the system. I think from an evidence-based point of view, we can build that evidence as we're going, and I think we are doing that. I mean, I think it has been a long time since there's been innovation, but I think there are innovations coming in the mental health system. I think, first of all, it is moving much more towards involving people with lived experience in the design of the systems and in helping to set up a system that is going to meet their needs. We are also looking at new treatments. You know, the field of psychedelics is perhaps one of the newer areas of that has potential for effectively treating mental health disorders. We've started doing that in Australia perhaps before the evidence is in, but we'll build the evidence as we're going. So I think that it's possible to be evidence-informed and evidence-driven without necessarily having to rely on the evidence already being there. And I think the evaluation component of clinicians taking it, making sure that they're evaluating what they're doing, mental health systems evaluating what they're doing, is part of being evidence-driven. And using the lived experience of their patient or client, as well as their own lived experience of treating their clients, multiple clients, to inform what they're doing and evaluating what they're doing and measuring outcomes.
Thanks. Thank you. Is there time for one more comment or question? And then we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately.
Hi, thank you everyone on the panel for your amazing contributions tonight. It's amazing. I am a consumer consultant within the system. However, I did not recover or discover my ability to recover within the system. I avoided the system for some reason. I had internal wisdom to avoid the system. And I found recovery through an amazing innovation in peer-led recovery programs through a program that deals with storytelling, the body, and relational connection called Left Right Hook, which was created by Dr. Donna Lyon, who is a survivor. And I'm wondering, through all of our efforts to reform the system, do we in fact need to redirect those efforts towards actually supporting lived experience initiatives that are happening outside the system, to building new structures and new models of care? Is reforming the system just beating our heads against a brick wall? Should we just empower those with lived experience to create the services and supports that we need?
Thank you. And maybe I'm going to ask Maggie to respond to that, make comment.
There are a number of initiatives outside the medical model looking at alternatives in the lived experience space. Unfortunately, one of those wasn't funded, two of them weren't funded in the recent budget. That doesn't mean they're not going to be funded, it's just a matter of time. I'd like to see them funded, and that is recommendation 29 and the Healing Place. And what the Healing Place offers as an alternative is huge. It's a huge space to fill. And the fact that it's led by lived experience is significant right throughout. So I think, you know, we have some fantastic peer workers who are working out there under all conditions, who just get the story when they meet somebody on the ward. They just get the story. And that person doesn't need to tell the story again to anybody else. It's really unique. They're fantastic.
Thanks, Maggie. Maybe to wrap up, I'm going to ask very, very briefly each of our speakers about a key takeaway in a few words that you would wish the audience, the online audience, to take away from what you've said. And maybe I'll start... Oh, you've got the mic. Maggie, start with you.
I think we just have to do as much as a pebble, because collectively we will make a rock.
Kerry?
It's political, hence needing collective action. It's a civil rights movement, but collectively, if we're all on the same page, we can do it.
I think it starts with each individual learning about trauma and its impacts and supporting those people you know through that trauma-informed approach.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Tonight's presentations and conversations have really challenged us, I think, and I think the three speakers come from slightly different perspectives, but there are some key commonalities in what you've said. I hope that it has caused us to reflect on how our systems play a significant role in influencing trauma, both in terms of causing trauma and in shaping the responses and recovery processes for individuals who experience trauma. For me, a key takeaway from all of the presentations is the importance of the relationships that we have with other people, and how relationships, be they in the system, but we've heard from Maggie and Kerry, outside the system, are the things that can instil hope and assist people in their recovery. I'd now like to present our speakers with a small token of our appreciation, which will be handed to me. Thank you. Oh, do you want to present that? Yeah. And as we're doing that, I'd like to reiterate our thanks to Frank Woodcock and the Woodcock family for making this event possible. Their support has been decades long, and we bring together people to create positive change, challenging conversations that will help build a different and better response for people who experience mental health challenges and their families. Unfortunately, none of Frank's family members were able to attend, but I do think it's important we let them know how deep our gratitude is. I'd also like to thank all of you and the online audience for your interest in this topic and for attending tonight on a very cold Melbourne evening, and remind you that should you wish to talk to our peer helpline, they are still available or available tomorrow morning. And I have had only glimpses of this terrific graphic presentation. We will be sending it out in the next couple of days to all attendees. I now invite you to talk amongst yourselves, to have a snack before you go as we leave this lecture. Thank you to our presenters again.